Hi there. Welcome once again to our accounting classroom. I am Agnes Seeley and I will be talking to you today about process costing. This presentation was prepared by Raquel Small. Now, what is process costing? Process costing is a form of operation costing used in industries where units are continuously mass-produced through various stages. So your product goes through different stages and it's a mass production that goes on when it comes to process costing. Now the products that you are producing are usually similar in nature or identical, and the output from one stage is usually transferred as input into another stage until the inputs are finalized as completed units. In other words, because the product is going through various stages, it moves. When it ends one stage, whatever it ends at, then that becomes the input for the next stage. So that will continue until your product comes to a final end where you have completed it, and then it will then go to your finished goods. Now this form of costing is used on a variety of industries that extract raw materials that must pass through many stages in becoming the finished product. For example, places like breweries, paper making industries, food processing industries, pharmaceutical industries, and refineries industries, just to name a few. So for example, your oil is extracted in its raw form, but it must go through a process before you can use it as gasoline or diesel. Similarly, if you are making something like beer or wine, they have to go through various processes before they reach the final stage where it goes to market. What is the basis of process costing? Now, the raw materials must pass through each stage, accumulating any associated costs incurred in the conversion of the material to the finished product. So, for example, again, using your oil, that is the raw material, the oil that you would have extracted from the earth. It is going to go through different stages. So at each stage, it will accumulate a cost based on the fact that you're trying to convert it from that raw state that you took it out of the earth into a final product that you can sell to the consumer. So each stage, it is accumulating costs. Now the cost of each unit of product remains the same. In other words, each unit of your product will consist of materials, labor, expenses, and production overheads. The labor, expenses, and production overheads are used in the stages to convert the materials from one state to another state. Now, when you group your labor, your expenses, and your production overhead together, they are usually referred to as conversion costs. So in some questions that your examiner may give you, you may see labor, expenses, and production overhead separately, identified separately. But then in another question given by an examiner, you may see conversion costs. What we want you to recognize that conversion cost is your labor, your expenses, and your production overheads grouped together. Now, each stage of the process make up the work in process inventory until the units are completed and transferred to finished goods. Now, when we would have looked at the topic of job order costing, we said that when a job is being worked on, it is in progress. So similarly, in process costing, when the product is being worked on, it is in progress, and it is called work in progress inventory. And the product will remain in the work in progress inventory area until it is completed. And just like job order costing, when the product is finished, it is transferred out of the work in progress inventory into your finished goods inventory. Now, the inventory must also be valued at each stage to determine the value of the output transfer. So when your product is in stage 1, you must evaluate at that stage to determine the cost that is being transferred from stage 1 to stage 2. And that continues until you get your final product. So we're seeing here that the inventory must be valued at each stage to determine the value of output transfer. Now, due to the continuous nature of the production, because remember they are going through a process, so it is a continuous thing that is happening with your product. So due to this continuous nature, the cost per unit must be calculated by estimating the number of completed units expected to be made within the process. That is the concept of equivalent units. So what we're seeing here is that because you're going through this continual process of your production, your cost per unit, your cost for each unit must be calculated. But how do you do that? You do it by estimating the number of completed units that you expect to be made within that particular process. So because you're going to be estimating the number of units you expect to get within the process, this is where the concept of what we call equivalent units comes about. Now, the concept of equivalent units estimate the number of units that should be completed based on the percentage or the degree of material, labor, expenses, and production overhead. We are going to see this in an example question because I will not present this information to you without demonstrating how this is done. So we're seeing here that the concept of equivalent units estimate the number of units. So we're doing an estimate that should be completed, and we are estimating how much of these units should be completed based on the percentage of materials, labor and expenses and production overhead worked on in the process to make the number of units. So let's say you have 50% of the material, 40% of the labor, 20% of expenses, 30% of production overhead. So we're seeing here that you'll be using that percentage or the degree of the materials, labor, and expenses to determine these equivalent units. So for example, if 30% of labor was used in a process to make 400 units, remember 30% of labor being used in a process to make 400 units, the equivalent units that we are estimating would be 400 units multiplied by 30%, which will equals 120 units for the labor use. So that would be our equivalent units, the 120 units for the labor use. Now, as I stated earlier on, we must also value our inventory in process costing. Now, the valuation of inventory is done using two methods. So your work in progress inventory is valued using two methods. One is first in, first out, or FIFO. Then you have the weighted average cost method, which is also called FIFO. You probably would have encountered these terms first in first or FIFO previously when you would have done another accounting course and you had to value inventory. Now the first in first out method dictates that any incompleted inventory at the start of a period in the process must be worked on first before other units are started. So in other words, at the beginning of the process, you had units that were incomplete from before. The first in first out method is telling you you must work on those units that were incompleted prior before you start working on any new units. So if you have to do new units, you cannot start those units unless you work on the ones that were incomplete prior. The weighted average cost method, on the other hand, dictates that the units completed are all assumed to be started in the same period. So that is what weighted average cost is doing. The weighted average is assuming that all of your units were started around the same time. They're not assuming that some start before and you are now going to start the others. They're assuming all were started the same time. Now let's look at the first in first out method. Now we go through some steps when we are going to value our inventory using the first in first out method. So here are a few steps. Now the steps used to determine the value of inventory in work in progress. Step 1, you must prepare the equivalent units table to calculate the units for each cost element. And remember, we are dealing with a manufacturing business and we have to look at the elements of cost, which are things that your direct material, your material, your labor, your production overhead. Okay? So we're saying you're going to prepare an equivalent unit table to calculate the units for each cost element introduced in the process during the period under review. So you're going to be looking at the cost elements for that particular period or that process that you're looking at. Now the equivalent units must be computed for the opening inventory, the fully completed units, and closing inventory. So you have to do equivalent units for opening inventory, fully completed, and closing inventory. Now opening inventory was previously started. That's what your opening inventory is. Your opening inventory is the inventory that you would have started before, which would have been your closing inventory prior. So your closing inventory at one stage is the opening inventory at the other stage. So opening inventory was previously started and must be completed in the present period by the percentage of work used within the present period to complete these units. So we are going to break this down when we look at our example question. Now your fully completed units, so the fully completed started and finished during the present period. So this is what fully completed units are. Those are the units that were started and finished during the period under review. Your closing inventory units, however, are the units that you would have started work on, but you have just partially completed those in this period. So that is what your closing inventory units are. The ones you started, but you have only partially completed them. Here is a look at our equivalence units table using the first in first out method. And you see here that we have details, raw material, cost elements. So example, material, another cost element, maybe that might be labor, and then the third cost element might be production overhead. And you see here that we have opening inventory, fully completed, and closing inventory, because we stated that you must compute equivalent units for these three things here: opening inventory, fully completed, and closing inventory. Now we would examine the percentage and we'll look at the 100% when it comes to fully completed, because it means that there's no more work needs to be done on that product. It is completed, so it's 100% complete. Now step 2 in the first in first out method of process costing, you have to calculate the cost for one equivalent unit. So that is what you have to do. You have to calculate the cost for one equivalent unit for each cost element. The cost incurred during the present period is divided by the equivalent units of the cost element. In other words, our previous table that we would have looked at, you would have seen that we had a total underneath each cost element. That would be our total equivalent units. We are seeing here that you would take the cost incurred for materials, labor, and production overhead, and you are going to divide it by that total you would have calculated in the equivalent units table, and that will give you your cost per equivalent unit. After you come up with your cost per equivalent unit, then you would add the cost per equivalent units for each cost element, and that will give you your total cost per equivalent unit. Your third step will be to value your inventory. So now you have the valuation of your inventory units, or evaluation of the cost with respect to your inventory units. Now to compute the associated production cost, you then have to multiply the cost per equivalent unit by the number of equivalent units for opening inventory, fully completed, and closing inventory for each cost element. So you would remember, if you go back in this video, I would have shown you an equivalent units table. And in that equivalent unit table, we would have had opening inventory, let's say for raw materials. And we would have calculated equivalent opening inventory and the equivalent units for raw material on the opening inventory. We would have done it for labor and for production overhead. Similarly, we will have our equivalent units for material, labor, and production overhead for the fully completed units. And finally, we will have equivalent units for closing inventory on the material, labor, and production overhead. We're saying that you have to take the cost elements, the equivalent unit on each cost element, and multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit for that particular cost element that we would have just calculated in our previous slide. Now this is what our calculation valuation of inventory table will look like. So here we have what the opening inventory is at the beginning, and then after that we will calculate the remaining costs on the opening inventory. We will then calculate the cost of our fully completed units, and then we'll calculate the cost of our closing inventory using each cost element, and then that will give us our final cost. Now your step 4 is to then prepare the process account. So we are going through all of these steps to get to this part here where we do our T account with our process account. So all of what we would have done prior would have been our calculation, because now we're going to put that information now into the T account, which is our process account. So step 4 tells us to prepare the process account that is part of the work in progress inventory. So we've examined the valuing inventory using the first in first out method. So you can pause this video, you can go back and assimilate all the information that I would have shared with you with respect to valuing inventory using first in first out, and then you can come back and look at the weighted average cost method. So we are going to examine next the weighted average cost method in valuing our inventory using under the process costing part.